From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. The Congress in Peru is debating a motion of confidence presented by the government of President Martín Vizcarra. Vizcarra's Prime Minister Salvador del Solar arrived at the Congress to support the motion. It is part of the president's attempt to push through a package of anti-corruption reforms, which a majority in Congress has been resisting. If the motion is approved, the laws will then be passed. If it isn't, the president could dissolve Congress.
It is urgent that we save our democracy from corruption. It is urgent that we prevent people who are guilty of criminal offenses from representing us. It is urgent to strengthen the political parties, encourage committed citizens to play a part in politics, and make it possible for us as Peruvian citizens once again to trust in our authorities.
Our correspondent Jaime Herrera is at the Congress in Lima and sent us this report.
What is being debated here in the Congress now is of huge interest to the Peruvian population in general, and that is the motion of confidence presented by the government of President Martín Vizcarra. As you'll remember, last year the government called a referendum in which a big majority of Peruvian voters, over 80%, said they agreed with the need to reform both the judicial system and the political system in order to deal with the many cases of corruption in the country. But although that was approved, so far the Congress has made no progress in adopting these reforms. So what the government is doing today is insisting that the Congress approve this motion of confidence, and if it does express its confidence in the administration of President Vizcarra, that would mean it is making a commitment to pass all of these reforms. If it doesn't, then this would be the second time that there's been a vote of no confidence in President Vizcarra, and that means he would have the power to dissolve Congress and call new elections. Now, there are some political groups in Congress who have already said that they will vote against the government's motion of confidence. Among those is the Broad Front group in Congress. And we have with us one of the members of Congress for the Broad Front, Wilbert Rosas. So, Congressman Rosas, why have you decided to vote against this motion?
Although with this confidence motion, the government is putting forward a number of measures that are worthy of our consideration for the reform of the Constitution, it seems to us that these are really just palliative measures. The fundamental issues are not those that are up for discussion at the moment in this constitutional reform. The fundamental question that needs to be addressed in the constitutional reform is the economic question, because the current economic model just allows the rich to get richer while the poor get poorer. They are not discussing the investments in mining that pollutes the environment and harms the population in the mining and oil extraction regions. They are not discussing the damage done to people's health by contamination with heavy metals in those mining centers and in the Amazon basin.
Voting down the confidence motion would give the president the right to dissolve Congress. Are you in agreement with that?
I think we support what the country wants. And what the country wants is that this Congress be closed. Why? Because there is a majority here which not only obstructs legislation and betrays the country, but which governs in the interests of big companies and not in the interests of the people. I think the Peruvian people have realized this, and they want this Congress to be closed down so that a new phase can begin. And that new phase means drawing up a new constitution.
That was Congressman Wilbert Rosas of the Broad Front, which is in favor not only of rejecting the motion of confidence in the government, but also of calling new elections for a new Congress to replace this one that they say should be dissolved. Back to you in the studio.
We thank Jaime Herrera for that report. The United States Treasury Department has announced harsh new restrictions on travel to Cuba as the Trump administration tightens its blockade against the island. Visits by cruise ships as well as yachts and other passenger vessels will be banned, as will those by private and corporate aircraft. Another popular form of travel to Cuba by educational groups is also now prohibited. Both Cubans and tourists have condemned the new actions.
Yes, the US people want to come to Cuba. They want to come here for tourism. Cuba is a main stop for cruise tourism. Their main objective is to come to Cuba. And the sanctions are hardening. And they even hurt US people themselves, and us even more. That's why the US government won't be able to do anything here. Nothing is ever going to soften us. That should be clear to Donald Trump.
That's a shame. That's a real shame. The government should do what's best for its people.
He's a businessman, and he always just thinks about money, and he doesn't think about the people and their heart. Yeah.
Our correspondent in Havana, Alian Fernandez, has the details.
Here in Cuba, there has been strong condemnation of these measures taken by the US Treasury Department, which bans visits to Cuba by educational groups from the United States. The Trump administration is also blocking cruise ships from visiting Cuba, and this is very important. The Cuban president said on Twitter that his country will not be cowed or distracted by these new threats, and that the Cuban people will respond with more work, more creativity, and more resistance. For his part, the foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, condemned the measures, which he said tighten the blockade against Cuba. He said Washington is trying to strangle the Cuban economy and damage the living standards of the Cuban people to try to wring concessions from the Cuban government. But he was clear that this attempt would fail once again. Since Donald Trump arrived in the White House, we should remember that the campaign against Cuba has been stepped up dramatically. The most recent measure before this was the application of Title III of the Helms-Burton Law, which allows U.S. individuals and entities to sue Cuban and foreign companies in U.S. courts for the use of properties nationalized by the revolution. Last week, the head of U.S. Affairs at the Cuban Foreign Ministry, Carlos Fernández de Cosio, said that until recently it was possible to talk about a setback in relations between the United States and Cuba, but that this had now turned into open hostility and aggression on the part of the U.S. administration.
We thank Alian Fernandez for that report. Moving on, the Institute of Legal Medicine in Nicaragua has concluded that skeletal remains found in the department of Carazo match with Bismarck Martinez, a Sandinista who was kidnapped during the 2018 failed coup. Analysis of genetic markers show that the remains coincided with the DNA of the children and brothers of the victim. The case of Bismarck Martinez made a big impact in Nicaragua because he was well known for representing the innocent people who suffered at the hands of violent right-wing opposition groups. The attempts to destabilize Nicaragua, which targeted the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega, began in April 2018 and lasted for months.
15 polymorphic genetic markers were analyzed in order to determine the identity, and 25 polymorphic genetic markers were subsequently analyzed. These two types of analysis allow for the determination of the affiliation that exists between the family members of Bismarck Martinez.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. In Bolivia, let's go to another story now. Let's go to Bolivia now.
Announcement made by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal is evident in the centre set up for voter registration for persons that are aged 18 years and over.
It's the first time that you only need an identification card and proof of address.
I am registering for the first time. I will already turn 18 and I am registering to vote in this election, like every citizen should.
This process will continue until July 14th for Bolivians that live both locally and abroad.
In keeping with our electoral calendar, we start this phase, which will last for a period of 45 days. This allows people who are not enabled to cast their vote to register via the biometric voting lists so they can participate in the October 20 elections.
1,541 biometric registration machines are enabled, of which 258 will go abroad.
We are working in Bolivia's 9 departments with more than 1,400 biometric registering equipment, which have been deployed to urban and rural areas. The electoral body and the civil registry service in particular are working to register Bolivians in the 22 countries abroad.
The Bolivian electorate is fundamentally young, with at least 50% of the electorate between 18 and 35 years old.
We call on young people not to wait until the last day that we will be registering, which is July 14. It is better to do it before.
The registration abroad began in 22 countries, and in the upcoming days it will extend to 33. The general elections will take place on October the 20th, and a total of 9 candidates are running.
And that was a story in Bolivia where the Supreme Electoral Tribunal began mass voter registration for people who are turning 18. Let's go to another story now. Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza has accused the United States of orchestrating a new plan to confuse the public about the situation in Venezuela. According to Arreaza, supposed researchers linked to the U.S. Center for Strategic and International Studies are preparing false documents to justify their actions against Venezuela. He said these files seek to include Venezuela in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism and label the government of Nicolás Maduro a transitional criminal organization. Venezuela is prepared to defend itself against any enemy that is armed and dangerous. That's according to the president of the National Assembly, Diosdado Cabello. He was speaking during a ceremony marking the 200th anniversary since military officer and political leader Simón Bolívar led his army across the Arauca River in Venezuela. Cabello said what is happening to Venezuela is a lesson for the world, noting that there are soldiers who kneel before imperialism and its lackeys. However, he said Bolívar had it right when he took the fight to Venezuela's enemies.
Bolívar was able to understand what was going on in Venezuela, but he also had great insight to recognize that it not only affected the Bolivarian nation, but it was a continental struggle. His clear vision made him think about the great homeland which led him to cross the Arauca River.
A doctors leader in Honduras has condemned President Juan Orlando Hernandez's decision to revoke his privatization decrees as fake. Soyapa Figueroa said no organization representing health or education workers had taken part in the decision. Teachers' representatives have already said they will continue the protest.
We don't want to give our people crumbs. We are not going to beg. We don't want solidarity food parcels. We want them to respect our rights like health, education. If money continues to be used to repress people, the people will be against those who betray them and sell them out.
And also in Chile, teachers began an indefinite strike after months of failed negotiations with the government as they call for better labor conditions and improvements to public education.
The country awoke to mass protests. These are Chile's teachers, one of the most aggrieved groups under the policies implemented by President Sebastián Piñera's government.
It's fundamental to express our concern about education, our children and the youth, because public education has been totally abandoned.
This translates to
a government that wants to privatize, that insists on turning education into a business. But we, the people and teachers, demand the education be citizens' right.
For years, teachers and students have been fighting alongside each other for a right that had been denied by the military dictatorship.
We call on all social and political organizations committed to defending people's rights to join us in our fight for students' rights, for the improvement of public education, and for all the rights that this capitalist and neoliberal government has trampled upon.
Their rights have been repressed under the disguise of Piñera's project called Safe Classrooms.
We don't want to be harassed anymore, nor do we want to be criminalized outside our schools. Every day, students are being detained. They have been tortured inside police cars and abandoned in parks afterwards. We need this to stop. One of these days, we'll find a dead student, and that's not what we want.
But the president doesn't seem to listen to any of these concerns. It seems that for the right wing, education is a double-edged sword, a rhetorical question that the government answers with the removal of history as a subject from all schools.
Everything that was left behind is being dismantled. Student movements are being criminalized, and now the removal of history is an attack against students' ability to think critically.
Education versus social control. It's been a constant fight between the people and the government in a country scarred by dictatorship.
Constitutional Court did not reach a decision on equal marriage today without specifying the exact date. The Constitutional Court took to Twitter to announce their decision will be made public in the coming days. Various LGBT organizations in Ecuador are waiting for the court's decision. They say that if the decision is positive, Ecuador will become one of the many countries that have legalized same-sex marriage. And the head of the organization, Equidad, said all Ecuadorians should be able to enjoy the same rights and that the measures taken by the president on this matter have not been effective.
Lawful union in Ecuador does not work. That's why we believe in Ecuador everyone should be able to enjoy the same rights. Whether you use these rights or not, that's a personal decision. But a third person shouldn't be the one deciding who has rights and who doesn't.
And members of the Caribbean LGBT community celebrated pride in their identities as this year's Pride Parade in Queens, New York. Thousands participated in the event, which is in its 4th year. Queens-based queer advocacy group Caribbean Equality Project also took part in the festivities, happily displaying pride in their Caribbean heritage and identity. The event also commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, which had seen 6 days of protests and violent clashes following a police raid of the Stonewall Inn, a gay club in New York. 1 week after Trinidad and Tobago inked a new deal with global energy giant Shell, in the Netherlands, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley visited the company's Wood Creek campus in the U.S. During the tour of Shell's Texas facility, the PM and his delegation received an update on the company's business as well as a review of its plant growth portfolios for Trinidad and Tobago. The milestone agreement will see Trinidad and Tobago getting increased revenues from the sale of liquefied natural gas delivered from fields in and around the island. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. As U.S. President Donald Trump continues his state visit to the United Kingdom, protests are taking place in central London. Thousands turned out in opposition to the U.S. president and his highly controversial policies. Politicians from the opposition Labour Party as well as the Green Party and various social movements spoke at the rally and expressed their distaste at Trump being revered with a state visit. They said they don't believe he deserves that honor. And addressing the anti-Trump protesters, the Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn called for an end to racism, misogyny and religious persecution. He added that mobilizations against political extremism demonstrate the people's determination for positive change.
So I say to our visitors that have arrived this week, think on, please, about a world that is one of peace and disarmament, is one of recognizing the values of all people, is a world that defeats racism, defeats misogyny, defeats the religious hatreds that are being fueled by the far right in politics, in Britain, in Europe and the United States. Do you know what? Together we can make a big difference. Together we can change this world. Together we can bring about that peace and justice. And by our demonstration here today, we've shown just how determined we, all of us, are to achieve that better place and that better world. Thank you for being here today for peace, for justice and disarmament.
And now to Africa. Living standards in Zimbabwe have deteriorated as prices on various goods and services continue to rise due to sanctions imposed by the United States. As the U.S. and its European allies maintain economic sanctions imposed on the previous government, prices of fuel and basic commodities increase. The country cannot access lines of credit to revive the economy. The government is, however, trying to control the situation by coming up with homegrown solutions.
In his response regarding monopolies and cartels, that one of the reasons why we really need to deal with the issue of monopolies and cartels because they contribute to the price hikes that we see for some of the sectors. They are the reason, either acting on their own or acting with others in collusion, they lead to these price hikes.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.